Good evening, everyone. Allison Skaberg here. We are here as the ADDA support group. This is the Fort Bend chapter. We're happy that you are here with us tonight. The ADDA is a support group that was started way back in 1987. Pam Esser was the founder of this organization, and there are multiple support groups all across the greater Houston area. Some serve adults with attention deficit. Some serve parents. This is basically a parent support group for children that have ADHD, really, we have a lot of attendees that have a lot of other diagnoses as well that kind of cross over in some of these arenas. This support group has typically met face to face the last Tuesday of every month, and we used to meet at Sugarland Baptist Church. And then since COVID, we moved this group to an online forum, and each month we typically have a speaker that talks to us as parents. It could be any number of topics. It could be medicine related, it could be behavior, it could be parenting, you name it. We've kind of had a speaker on those topics. So tonight your cameras and your microphones are muted. We are recording tonight's presentation, and you will get an email either tomorrow, probably tomorrow, with the recording. But we do welcome your questions tonight. We are excited to have back with us Lindsay Asawa, licensed clinical psychologist with Missouri City Family Counseling. This year, what we know is that a lot of families, there's just been struggles. Whether you have a child with ADHD or not, this pandemic has caused a lot of struggles for a lot of people, and those have been complicated by families that are dealing with other disabilities with their kids and homeschooling and you name it. So tonight, I hope that you feel that you're not alone. Number one, I hope that you feel encouraged, and I hope that you will take away a couple of nuggets that Lindsay is going to share with us. Lindsay is a personal friend, and her and I actually kind of started this chapter in Fort Bend. I don't know, I guess it was like 5 years ago. Time flies, Lindsay.
Yeah, I know, right?
So Lindsay is a regular to our group, and she is a parent herself. And so I am super, super excited to have you back with us tonight, and excited for what you can share. One last thing that I wanted to say is, it was Pam's mission never to require a person that, attends these events or comes to our meetings or anything like that to require membership to this organization. However, I will say that this organization can use our support, and membership is cheap. It's $40 a year. They do put on a conference that kind of bounces back and forth between Houston and Dallas, and they have renowned speakers from all across the country that come in, and there's just a ton of information out there. So should you benefit from tonight or any of the other meetings that you have attended, please do consider joining the organization. And when we send that email out with this recording, there will be a link in there on how to join and how to go about doing that. So thanks so much for being here. Again, put your questions in the chat box tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Allison. Okay, hi everyone. So I'm going to be talking today about finding confidence and success with ADHD. And part of the reason I decided to talk about this is I am a licensed psychologist. I co-own a practice in Missouri City, and we see so many kids, teens, and adults with ADHD. And I would say this is probably the biggest issue that we deal with in therapy, and we see it in our evaluations that we do. But the lack of confidence is something that's striking, and it has long-term impacts. And so I really felt passionate about this topic, and I talk about this to every family I work with. And so I thought it was kind of time to do a presentation on this. So just to tell you quickly about myself. So this is our clinic in Missouri City. I do testing and evaluations for children through adults. I specialize in ADHD. And so this is an area that I've spent years learning about and working with clients. evaluating and treating clients with ADHD. And then I am a parent of 3 kids, and 2 out of my 3 have now been diagnosed with ADHD. And it's partly why I am so passionate about this. And it's certainly a type of brain that's just in our family. And you'll hear me talking about ADHD brain and using that term a lot. And because I really feel strongly, and I think a lot of people in my field, in the mental health field, would agree that ADHD is not necessarily correctly identified as a disorder. It's really something that is a type of brain. It's a way that your brain is wired and can be challenging in some situations and actually can be beneficial in others. And so I use that term ADHD brain to kind of emphasize that. So if you need to contact me, feel free to give me a call or email me. We do offer therapy. We have several therapists at our clinic, as well as other evaluators. We also do groups from time to time. We've had lots of kids with ADHD go through our children and teen groups. And so feel free to contact me if you need anything or if you have questions. So these are the 4 topics that I wanted to go over tonight, because I think these are the 4 most important things relating to this. Some mental health outcomes, because I want you to know why this topic is important, what we tend to see in the long term, and then some predictors of success. And I'm basing this on the research, on what we have found that really works, that really does lead to long-term success in children with ADHD brains. And then based on that research and based on my experience as a psychologist, I wanted to just give you some strategies and tips for how to continue building confidence in your kids. And then the last is ADHD success stories. I just pulled out a couple of those. There are so many. There are countless success stories that you can read about. But I think there's a lot we can learn from those who have been successful. So the first is mental health outcomes. So a couple things I wanted to point out. These studies, I just pulled out 2 studies. These had very, very large samples. And what they did was they looked at long-term rates of mental illness in people who have been diagnosed with ADHD and people who have not. And they compared those 2 groups. And so you can see the 2 numbers after each of these terms. So in the first study, anxiety rates were much, much higher, 47% in those with ADHD, 19% in those without ADHD. Mood disorders, which primarily would include depression, was also much, much higher. And then rates of substance abuse were also higher. And I wanted to just add to that, that this is often in untreated ADHD, untreated cases of ADHD, not treated. And then another study, just to kind of reiterate this, a more recent study in 2018 found a lot of the same things. So much higher rates of depression, much higher rates of anxiety. And this study actually also included suicide and self-harm, and also found much higher rates for those with ADHD. So these are really, really serious numbers. And this really concerns us in the mental health field. And I can tell you just from about 14 years of practicing and working with so many people with this diagnosis, that this is the part that's the most concerning to me, is I see people coming in with symptoms of depression and anxiety that are comorbid with the ADHD diagnosis. And that's what we have to spend a lot of time treating. So there are some really serious outcomes. And here's one reason why. So it is estimated that those with ADHD receive 20,000 more negative messages by age 10 than they do positive messages. And I don't know about you, but I absolutely believe this, just from what I've heard from the kids and the adults that I work with, and just seeing what family members have experienced. There's just so many negative messages that can be unintentionally given by teachers, friends, parents, siblings. And so I think this is a huge reason why we see some of these negative mental health outcomes. And these negative messages entirely affect self-esteem and confidence. And so part of that is this feeling of shame. And I hear about this again and again in the sessions and in the evaluations that I do. And so this is a psychologist who actually wrote this article about shame and having ADHD. And I love what she said here, so I wanted to read it with you. So she said, I remember sitting in my 3rd grade classroom, dancing to a song I was singing in my head when the teacher turned around and said, Emily, sit still, pay attention. Did you take your meds this morning? I hadn't realized that I wasn't sitting still. I didn't feel like I was misbehaving. All I felt was shame. Looking back on those days, I don't believe that my fidgeting was impeding my ability to learn. It helped me focus. What really hurt me that day was the feeling that I was not okay the way I was, that my natural inclination to move made me frustrating and intolerable. That is the experience for many children with ADHD. So I thought that really sums it up. I mean, that's kind of word for word what I've been hearing from clients for years. And this is why this has become such an important topic to me. And the difference between shame and guilt, by the way, is when someone criticizes your behavior, you feel guilty about that behavior. But when someone criticizes who you are as a person, then you experience a sense of shame. And so a lot of our kids who have ADHD brains are feeling that they are not okay who they are. And that's why they're experiencing that sense of shame. So a couple studies just to show you a little bit more about some predictors of success. So what we found, there was a really good review of 21 studies. So this was a big review that looked specifically at resiliency and ADHD. So how can we predict which children are going to be resilient who have ADHD brains? And what's fascinating about this study is they found these 3 things that stood out. And by the way, if you notice, none of these have anything to do with ADHD symptoms, right? So what really stood out are acceptance by peers was a really big one. And they actually said that that was regardless of how they were doing in school. So even if they were failing in school, as long as they were accepted by some peers, that was really important predictor of success. The second was positive parenting. And so we're talking about being encouraging and supportive and praising them often and not criticizing and not attacking. And then the third was their perceived competence. So not their actual competence, by the way, their perceived competence. So do they feel competent in different areas of their life? And I think of that more as confidence, right? Do they feel confident? And if you look back at number 1 and number 2, both of those also impact confidence, right? So acceptance by peers helps them to accept who they are and feel more confident. Positive parenting and positive messages from their parents helps them feel more confident about who they are. And so those 3 things were the long-term predictors in this study. Another really big study or a big review that looked at 127 studies about self-esteem and ADHD. They found one major common factor across these studies, which was untreated ADHD predicted poor long-term self-esteem, whereas treatment of ADHD, and that's any kind, so that could be therapy or medication, led to improved long-term self-esteem. So this is another predictor, is treatment. And my theory behind that is whether it's treatment with medication or treatment with therapy, in both cases, we are improving self-esteem, right? We're allowing them to have more positive experiences. We are teaching them skills. We are helping them with the challenges that come along with ADHD, and that in turn improves long-term self-esteem. So that's another major predictor. And then this last one that I wanted to tell you about was a little bit different. This study, what they did was they interviewed successful adults with ADHD, and they did lots and lots of interviews. And then they went back and they reviewed all these interviews, and they tried to look for some themes, some common themes. And they found these 6 common themes. And a lot of them had to do with just having an ADHD brain and some of the good that comes along with that. So I think that's really important to note. The first one is creative and divergent thinking. And there's a whole bunch of research, by the way, showing that these are common factors in having an ADHD brain, is more creative thinking, and divergent, which is thinking outside the box. So that's something we see all the time. And that was a predictor of success. The second was courage. So a lot of these adults with ADHD brains tended to also have the courage to take risks. They were risk takers, right? They were willing to put themselves out there. They were willing to keep trying even when they failed. So courage was another thing that predicted their success. Number 3, both mental and physical energy. So we know our kids, sometimes they can't turn their brains off and their mind is always going, and they also can't turn their body off very easily. They have lots of physical energy. Well, both of those actually contributed to these adults' success in the long term. Those were good things. And then the 4th was how they related to others. They tended to have an ability through humor and through empathy to be able to relate to others. And I see that in so many of the clients that I work with. And so they were successful in fields that they chose to go into that involved relating to others. And then 5, of course, learning to manage their symptoms is part of this. I'm not saying that that's not an important piece of the puzzle. And sometimes that was through learning strategies on their own. Sometimes that was through treatment, but they did also attribute that to some of their long-term success. And then the last one, it was kind of a sense of wonder and being able to appreciate things, being able to look at the bigger picture. And so a lot of the kids I work with are very curious kids. And I'm sure a lot of you guys notice that about your own children. They're curious kids. And they kind of carry that into adulthood. And that's something that actually helps them look at things a little bit differently and appreciate things differently. And that contributed to success as well. So these are some of the predictors of success that we can kind of pull from that to help build our children's confidence and help support them. So if we do take away from those studies, and we also incorporate just the things that we've learned in the mental health field about how to build confidence, then these are kind of some of my suggestions that I want to give you guys. Number 1, and I think it's the most important, is understand and accept your child for who they are. This is so important. And I see so many parents struggling with this because they want their children to behave a certain way or to be a certain way or to reach certain goals. And we really want to send the message to our kids that we accept them and love them for who they are. And part of doing that means we need to understand them a little bit better. And that's all of what I do. So when I evaluate kids, I'm learning how their brain works. And then I'm giving that information back to their parents. And I see a change in these parents. When they understand their child and how their brain works, I see a difference in the parents and how they interact with them and how they interpret their behaviors. So it's such a helpful thing. So please learn about the ADHD brain. There's so many ways to do that. There's lots of great websites and articles and books, and I would be happy to send any of those to you if you're interested, but please learn more about it just so you have a better understanding of your child's brain. And once you understand, then try to choose the right environments or create the right environment for your child. Now that you know what they need, then figure out, are there things in your household that you could be doing differently? Or are you choosing schools and sports teams and extracurricular activities? Are you choosing them wisely? Are you making sure that you are choosing environments that are positive and supportive and that build them up? Or are they environments that really kind of tear them down? So really think about that, and then allow them time to be who they are. This is really important. I think our kids with ADHD brains, they're told all the time to stop being who they are, to be different, to calm down, sit down, be quiet, stop running around. And they need time occasionally to just be who they are, to just be silly and go outside and run around and scream and be loud and have sensory input. Lots of our kids are very sensory seeking, and they want to touch things and they want to make messes and they want to make noise. And I know that's hard on us as parents. And so we can't do that all the time, and they can't do that at school all the time, but we can create time for them to do that. And so build that in if you can. The next one is setting them up for success. So rather than just throwing them to the wolves, try to see if you can actually put them in situations with the right kind of support so that they will be successful, because every time they're successful, they internalize that and that becomes part of their perception of themselves. So we actually want to help create that for them. And you don't have to do that all the time, but sometimes if you can try to do this, it's very helpful. So create some islands of competence. That's a term that was used by another psychologist that I like, because it means find some little areas where your child feels competent and where they feel like they're good at something. It may not be school, honestly. It may be something totally unrelated. It might be computer programming. It might be Legos. It might be art. It might be music. But whatever it is, find those areas, those little islands of competence, and really support them and let them do it, and spend time with them as they're doing it, because it's really good for them. Really try to identify their strengths and their interests and support those, rather than focusing all of our attention on their weaknesses and what do we need to improve. Let's think about what are they already doing well. And it's so interesting when I interview parents sometimes, I ask them that question, and there's so many parents I talk with that are just completely stumped, because they're there to tell me about what's wrong. They're there to tell me about their child's weaknesses and what's not going well. And they just had to stop and really think about it. Well, what are they doing well? So really try to put more thought into that and help them to see what those strengths are. And then I put this last one on here: listen and collaborate, don't dictate. The reason for that is that I see parents oftentimes, and I do this myself, that when our kids are they're not doing what we want them to do, so we just tell them what they need to do. We say, just get it done. And they're having trouble with homework, and we say, okay, I'm taking away your computer time until you get your homework done, or until I see your grade go up. So we're dictating to them, right? We're not actually really helping. And sometimes it takes stopping and listening and really hearing what they have to say. Maybe they're having trouble getting their homework done because they need to change where they're doing their homework. Or maybe they're not understanding the concepts, and maybe they're getting behind. I mean, there could be so many reasons. And so you have to take time to really listen and work with them and help them problem solve. And then you may have a better solution, a better outcome than the dictating. The dictating oftentimes doesn't lead to the outcome that we want. Two other things. So we know that peer acceptance is really important from that study that I showed you. And so we want to actually help them create positive experiences with peers. And what I mean by this is don't just wait around and watch and hope that they're going to have some good experiences with peers. You can actually help make that happen. So one way is, help them find their people. So figure out, what kinds of kids do they do best with, and how can you find those kids? I had to do this with my son. He was struggling really making friends in his class. And first we went through and talked about, is there any child in your class that you feel like you connect with that maybe you could spend more time with? And there was one kid. And so I reached out to those parents and said, hey, can we get together sometime and let our kids spend time together? And that was helpful. But then I also realized, he told me one day that he doesn't have the same interests as a lot of the kids in his class. And he was very interested in coding. And so what I did was I put him in Code Ninjas, and that is where he met his current 3 best friends. So you have to just find the kids that they connect with and look for those kids and help them find them. And choose their extracurriculars carefully. If they are not connecting with the kids on their soccer team and they're not feeling good about themselves when they go to soccer practice, then maybe the sport itself is less important than the whole experience for them. Maybe it's time to change activities. And then be their coach throughout this time. So don't just stand back and watch, but sometimes pull them aside and give a suggestion. Or if they're struggling, they come home crying because something negative happened with the other kids at school, talk through it with them and come up with some ideas. And when they go do it the next day, ask them how it went. You can kind of be their coach and help them through some of these social difficulties. And then the last one I put on here, don't forget to take care of you. The reason for that is when you are not feeling great yourself, when you are stressed and overwhelmed, it's going to be harder for you to say positive things to your child and to look for the good in them, right? And we're more likely to snap at them. We're more likely to just say the wrong thing. And so I think it's really important that you need to take care of you and do what you need. If you are feeling overwhelmed, take some time for yourself. Do whatever it takes to be your best self so that you can be a more positive parent to your child. And part of that is drowning out the critics. And I know this as a parent of 2 kids with ADHD brains. People judge, right? People have a lot to say, and they will give you all kinds of opinions on what you should do or you shouldn't do. And it's hard because when we let that seep in, that does affect how we feel about our child. It affects how we talk to our child. So you have to kind of drown out the critics, and you have to have confidence in yourself. You know your child better than anyone. And part of that is finding a support system of other parents going through this. And that's why we're here. That's why ADDA exists. So be part of things like this where you can meet other parents that also have similar kids.
Lindsay, we have a question, and any of the questions, if your other slides are going to answer or whatever, then you can kind of move through it and come back to it. But what if you have a child with multiple diagnoses, intellectual disability, autism, but also, you know, ADHD? How do you go about finding therapy, or how to get them reevaluated? Maybe, you know, all people like yourself are not created equally. How do they find the right fit for their child with their diagnoses?
Specifically for having them reevaluated?
Sure.
Is that the question? Okay. Well, so first of all, in order to get a really good, thorough evaluation, you need to see a licensed psychologist. So that's what we're trained to do, or a neuropsychologist. We are trained to do evaluations that kind of pull all the pieces together and really help you understand your child better and understand their diagnosis. I also would recommend reevaluating at least every 2 to 3 years, if possible. And part of the reason for that is there's a lot of change that can happen in that time. And it helps us to look at progress, but also new issues or concerns that might come up. And then as far as where to find a psychologist that does this, there are some that are in network with insurance, and you can contact your insurance and you can go that route, find out about from your insurance PhD level psychologists who are in network. And then you may have to contact them directly and ask them, do they do evaluations specifically, not just therapy? And then others are out of network. And there are lots of great psychologists in our area that do evaluations for kids. But I think the key is making sure, like I said, that it's a licensed psychologist and someone that specializes in doing full psychological or psychoeducational evaluations, not just bits and pieces. And I have seen that done from time to time, where someone will just do a very small amount of testing just to look at one thing maybe. And I think that's much less helpful because it doesn't help us understand the full picture and how all the pieces are connected. So it needs to be a thorough evaluation. I don't know if that answers the question, but
plus with ADHD, like you said in the beginning, the comorbid conditions are great. We often, yes. If you have, you know, that one diagnosis, there are other underlying diagnoses maybe you already know about, maybe you don't. But I have a question to your slide that you were just talking about. So helping them find their people, I call it their tribe, their tribe, where they belong, you know. But what about when you help them find their tribe, or you help them find their people? So they've started these relationships, and they're happy about it and things are going well, but then it falls apart and they struggle to maintain those relationships. Do you have any advice on that? Because I know that that's a common issue.
It is a common issue. And that's something that the kids we work with struggle with all the time. So that's, I think, where the coaching comes in helpful as a parent, you know, kind of talking to them about what's going wrong, what feedback has their friend given them, even if it was negative feedback, and talking to them about what could they learn from that and how can they respond to that friend. And then also helping to coach them through when to know when to walk away, I guess, because there are times when a friendship can actually become really harmful and detrimental to them. And you have to, they need help with that. We have to kind of help guide them through that and figure out when to draw the line and set boundaries with their peers as well, and when to just go a different route and look for other friendships. And then that's also something that we work on in therapy. So therapists can be very helpful with that, especially if you feel kind of at a loss with what to do at this point and how to help them. In therapy sessions, we work on social skills, we work on problem solving with regards to different social dilemmas, how to handle bullying, those kinds of things. And so that's another way to do that. There's also, that's another benefit of group, when we do these teen groups, and there's lots of other clinics around town that offer groups for teens. It's a good way to help them learn how to handle those kinds of difficult peer situations. And it also might be a good way for them to meet some new friends. So I think one goal is to not limit them to just that one friendship, because there are risks in having only one, right? And so if you can help them expand as much as possible, then that I think would be ideal. But you may have to really look at different ways of doing that, getting them involved in different activities, introducing them to friends of yours who may have a child that they would connect with. But I think it's helpful for them to at least develop a few connections. And if those connections are not going well, then finding some new ones.
Yeah, and I think that lack of confidence, we already know about the lack of confidence that kind of resides within them anyway. And then when they have these failed relationships, it kind of adds to that growing mountain of lack. And so I think that's a really, really good point. Thank you, Lindsay.
And you're welcome. Something I would add to that also is when I see a lot of, especially teens who do lack confidence, and what they will tend to do is hang on to those friendships for longer than is healthy. They are willing to change themselves, and they're willing to try to fit better if that will mean keeping that friendship. And that can be really harmful to them as well. So I think that's a way that we can boost their confidence by saying, you don't deserve to be treated that way. You need to set boundaries. And if your friend is not respecting those boundaries, then maybe they're not such a great friend to you. And so I think that can actually help with the confidence building.
Not to mention, if it's kind of caught before it's like escalating, and then we have the impulsive explosion, and then it's really hard to recover from that. So trying to prevent it kind of getting to that point where it's over the top, then that is helpful too, because
that helps a lot.
They keep trying, and then they internalize everything, and then they're kind of imploding, and then all of a sudden it's over.
It comes out. Yeah, exactly. Yes, I agree. I think another thing also that may happen is when they are struggling with some of those ADHD related behaviors, and their friends are getting frustrated with those behaviors, so helping them with some self-awareness can also be a good thing. So maybe helping them learn a little bit more about, maybe I talk too much in my interactions with my friends, and maybe I need to try to pull back a little bit when I feel like I'm dominating the conversation. That's really helpful for them to learn, and that's some good self-awareness. And then I've also worked with a lot of kids on just owning up to it, just kind of acknowledging that, hey, I'm really sorry. I struggle with just blurting things out impulsively, and I don't really mean it. And so if I said something that offended you, I'm really sorry about that. Just owning up to it can make a big difference in a friendship. So I think all of these things, we can just work with them, we can coach them. And if we need the help of a therapist to also work with them, then we can do that as well. Okay, so speaking of words, I think that I put this slide in here because a big part of positive parenting is how we talk to our kids, and trying to talk to them in a way that is not breaking them down, but that's building them up. So these are kind of the 5 big things that I wanted to mention. The first is critiquing the behavior, not the child. This goes back to guilt versus shame. If we critique the behavior, yes, they'll feel guilty that they made that mistake, but they can learn from it and they can move forward. If we critique the child, then they experience that sense of shame for who they are, and they hold on to that. So really think about how you're wording things, and try to word it about the behavior and not the child. Number 2 is when you are giving them praise and encouragement, try to be really specific about it. So rather than just coming home from an event and saying, hey, good job today, tell them why you think they did a good job. Did they do a good job because they didn't interrupt? They waited their turn before asking you for help? What is it that they did well? Because we want them to take that and keep doing it. And then the third thing, even more specific, try to point out examples of when they struggled and they overcame those struggles. I think that's really, really helpful feedback for them and helpful praise, because that's what we really want to highlight, is when they are struggling and then they're pulling themselves up and they're overcoming those challenges. That's what's going to build their confidence and build that grit that they need. So point that out every single time that happens. An example, my son this week has been struggling. He takes medication for his ADHD symptoms, and we weren't able to get his prescription renewed. So it's end of the year, lots of projects. He's at the GT Academy. And so he was really struggling without the help of that medication. And he had to rely a lot on different strategies and taking breaks and allowing himself to get up and move around. And he did such a great job. And so I was able to tell him how proud I am that he faced that challenge, and he was able to use his strategies and his skills, and he was able to overcome it. And I think that really, really made him feel good. And then the fourth is showing unconditional acceptance. So that's what I mentioned earlier about accepting them for who they are. Yes, we want them to work on their behavior and make improvements on some of their behaviors, and we want them to grow, but we love them and accept them for who they are. And we need to tell them that and show them that as much as we possibly can, because this is something I also hear a lot from my teen clients and even my adult clients, is that they never really felt accepted, that they felt like they were always making mistakes, and that affected how other people saw them and whether other people really loved them and cared about them. So then the last one is try, like we were talking about earlier, try to reframe ADHD, not just for your child, but for yourself as well. Try to think about it in maybe a more positive way, because I hear parents talking about it in a negative way to me. And then I worry that then that same message might be conveyed in how they speak to their child or communicate to their child. And I see that happening. And so be careful about how you talk about ADHD and about the symptoms.
Lindsay, I remember you talking one time before about ADHD being their superpower. They have more energy than some of the other people, more staying power, and some of the other things like. And so that was one thing that stuck with me, is the superpower, instead of, we're always thinking of it as a disability. But you know, they do have a lot of skills and characteristics that other people that don't have ADHD don't have. And those skills, when they're kind of redirected in a positive manner, I mean, they have the ability to be any one of those success stories that you suggested. And so I recall that. But one thing I would like you to do is the number one, you said critique the behavior, not the child.
Yes.
I want you to give us an example of that, because all of us parents have had these major meltdowns, major debacle, like big deal here. And so, and as a parent, you're like on the edge, you've just about had it. So give us an example of how we turn that around and we critique the behavior effectively and not the child.
Yes. Good idea. Okay, so I would say one example, I'm actually also thinking of lots of personal examples where this has come up with my kids, but one example, my daughter has just always been very energetic, very loud, very bouncy, very active. And so there's times when it can be overwhelming as a parent, and you kind of just need a break from that, right? And you might be trying to focus on something or do something else. And so I've really worked on how I communicate with her about that. And so what I'll say now is I know that it looks like you have a lot of energy right now, and that you're really needing to get that energy out. But in here, it's not helpful to me because I'm trying to work on something. So maybe can you go outside for a few minutes, or can you go upstairs and play with your brother for a few minutes? And I'll try to say it that way. I hear, and I've been tempted, and I've had to work on not using terms like annoying or, you know, I hear that a lot, that you're being so annoying. And kids take that stuff to heart. They do. I hear kids in our therapy sessions and in my evaluations, they will quote to me word for word a phrase that their parents or their siblings said to them, and it stuck with them to the point that they remember every word. And I think that we assume that they will let some of that bounce off, and it doesn't always bounce off. I'm here to tell you that a lot of those words really stick with them.
I think that did you take your medicine is the common one that parents say, and they're not saying that in a derogatory way because our kids are impulsive, they're forgetful. So granted, if they're, little ones, you're doling out the medicine, but as they get older, they're junior high, high school, maybe they're, supposed to be remembering to take their medicine themselves, but they do forget because they're forgetful.
Right.
But as parents, and I was guilty of this as well, of saying, did you take your medicine? I didn't mean it
Yeah.
in that derogatory
In that
way that it came out. And it was one time where she said, it upsets me when you say that, or you could say it quietly to me, like you don't have to announce it through the whole house, or kind of something along those lines. But it never really occurred to me. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, that we had tried some different things. So in that moment where you're maybe in a public setting, maybe you're in a restaurant, maybe you're at a friend's house, and there's a behavior that is less than ideal, but you don't want to. It needs to stop, but you don't want to embarrass the child or yourself. Can you talk about like those code words, like the agreement, like of a code word, or like a head nod, or a pop of a rubber band, something like that you can have that interaction with your child without creating a scene?
Yeah, no, and I think that's such a good idea. And I've seen that work with so many kids. But you can have, like, sometimes we'll do kind of a stop, like, let's stop for a second, or just hold up a hand. And you can come up with a signal with them and take a break. Take them aside for a few minutes and just talk to them. We struggled with this with my daughter at Girl Scout meetings. She would get so overstimulated, and then they would have sugar to top it off. And so she would get out of control. And so we started talking about it. I would suggest talk about it before you go. So if you started to notice a pattern, or even if you know your child well enough that you know that this might be a place that they're going to struggle with certain things, talk about it beforehand and say, hey, here's what the expectations are here. If I see that you're starting to get a little bit overly active, then I may pull you aside, and we're going to take some deep breaths, and we're going to take a break for a minute, because I just want to make sure that you don't get yourself to a point that you get in trouble or you have to sit in timeout. So you can kind of do some talking beforehand and planning to prevent it from happening. But I also agree with having a signal or a code word. And even teachers and students have done that too, and that's worked really well for them. But I really would suggest, you bring up that good point also, of not doing it in front of other people. It's so important. If you can pull them aside, or have their teacher pull them aside and have that discussion privately, then it doesn't go back to that experience of shame.
And I think also like thinking ahead, like as a parent, I've had to think ahead of the wise words. Like there's wise words to say, and there's unwise words to say. And like calm down is one of those unwise words. Like nobody likes somebody to say that to them. And our explosive kids that go from 0 to 100 relatively quickly. I mean, it just adds fuel to the fire. So I think, I had to think, like when you're not in the moment, like think ahead of some of those wise words that are calming and not escalating, even though you feel like you're escalating inside. So I feel like that definitely helped as well. This is good, Lindsay.
I agree. And when you say it calmly, it does have an effect on them. So, and sometimes it takes touch, by the way. So our kids with ADHD brains, oftentimes they will respond well to touch. Now, not all kids, and it also depends on those comorbid diagnoses as well. So maybe not kids with a diagnosis of ASD or autism spectrum, but kids with ADHD brains also tend to be alerted by touch. So we can kind of put a hand on their shoulder. We can, like, sometimes I'll have to take my daughter or my son's hands and kind of pull them closer. And I have to talk quietly. So if I talk quietly, it kind of calms them a little bit. I have to say, okay, I can see that you're getting really, really overly active right now. Look at me, look at my eyes. And you kind of have to talk them down a little bit. But if you go up, if you get louder and you get more explosive, then they will too. They will feed off of that energy, and it affects both of you. Okay, so let me show you the next screen, because this has a lot to do with what we were talking about, reframing ADHD. There's so many good things that come along with this type of brain, and I have been seeing it for 14 years, and I feel like I want to shout it off the rooftops, because kids with ADHD are not appreciated enough. for how amazing and incredible their brains are. And I think it's all about the way we look at it. So all of these terms on the left are some of the things that we use to make the diagnosis, and they're all very negative, right? But when we look at the other side, the right side, then we can see that all of those have kind of a positive flip side to it. And I've even done this with some of my clients where I've had them list out a lot of the negative words that people have used about them, that you're so hyper, you're so you talk too much, you're so annoying, you're just all of these negative things. And we've listed out all of those negative words, and then we've tried to find the flip side of it for each of those words. And that was such a helpful activity every single time, because it helped them to kind of reframe in their mind, oh, maybe these aren't such bad things. Maybe I have some positive things also. And then just to kind of highlight some of the potential success, there are like I said, there are countless success stories. There are websites and books that are all about success stories with ADHD. And this is just this fun little ADHD Wall of Fame graphic that these are famous people who are either known or believed to have had ADHD, because obviously they were not all diagnosed. However, looking back at their history, historians believe that some of them today would have been given this diagnosis based on their behavior and based on their abilities. But we do see on the right here, you can see that there are a lot of categories of successful people with an ADHD brain. We see lots of entrepreneurs. So the rates of successful entrepreneurs with ADHD are much higher than those without ADHD brains. And it has a lot to do with some of those things we talked about earlier, the creativity, the courageousness, that ability to connect with others, thinking outside the box. And so it leads a lot of people to be very successful at starting their own business. But we also see lots of famous athletes, artists, musicians, inventors, because of that thinking outside the box, political figures, writers, and actors. And part of it comes from even some of those things that we perceive as negative about having ADHD, like that ability to hyper-focus. You know, a lot of times we see that as a negative, that tendency to get too focused on one thing and not be able to shift. But I say ability because that is kind of the superpower, one of the superpowers that Allison was mentioning, because when you have the ability to become hyper-focused on something you love and you're passionate about, you could be the best in that area, right? You could go very far. And so it's just one of those things that we need to learn how to hone it and how to direct it, because it can be an incredible thing. So here's a couple of those success stories that I wanted to pull out and show you guys. So I tell kids all the time I talk to them about Michael Phelps. And for any of you who I'm sorry, I went too far. Okay, so for any of you who for any reason don't know who he is, so retired Olympic swimmer with 28 Olympic medals and 7 world records. So obviously very successful at his sport. But you may or may not know that he was diagnosed with ADHD when he was 9. And a teacher once told his mother, your son will never be able to focus on anything. So that was ironic looking at his future. He said, I simply couldn't sit still as a child. And so what his mom figured out early on was that swimming was a great outlet for his energy. She kind of figured out he's good at it. He loves it. It's one of those islands of competence I was talking about. So she let him pursue it. They were going to swimming every single day. And he talked about that activity, being in the pool, actually slowed down his mind. So he felt different when he was in the water and he thought differently. They also helped him to get through school using his sport of swimming. So they would use math problems and reading passages, and they would relate those back to swimming. And that helped him to stay focused and get through some of the challenges in school. So I think he's such a great example of how some of those challenges can also be kind of turned into abilities and lead to long-term success. And this is a quote that he had said, I look at myself every day and I'm so proud and so happy of who I am and who I was able to become. And that's what we want our kids to be able to say. And then another one is, let me see if I can, I'm sorry, I keep doing that. Another one is David NEELEMAN. So he is the founder of JetBlue Airways. And I chose him because he was an entrepreneur. and a really good example of one, because the way he described it is my ADHD brain naturally searches for better ways of doing things. So he was kind of known for his ability to innovate and think outside of the box, which is what we see from kids with ADHD brains all the time. He's the one that kind of developed this idea of in-flight television, as well as lots of other things. And here's an interesting quote. He said, "I knew I had strengths that other people didn't have, and my parents reminded me of them when my teachers didn't see them." So that's why that positive parenting is so, so important. We kind of have to serve as that buffer and that advocate, because our kids are not always going to be understood by others. One thing he said that he does, he still struggles with a lot of those challenges that come with having an ADHD brain, but he's found ways around it. So he's figured out that he needs to surround himself with people who manage a lot of the details, because he's learned about himself, he doesn't do well with the details. And so he's kind of, he's delegated that to others, and that's worked for him. And he said this quote at the end: "If someone told me you could be normal or you could continue to have your ADHD, I would take ADHD." So he really attributes his success to having an ADHD brain. And there's so many others who do as well. So I just want you to see these examples as a way of, or I guess, a sign of hope, that there could be so many great things in store, but it's all about kind of how we approach this with our kids and how we talk about having an ADHD brain and how we support them. These are 3 books that I would recommend that all have that different way of looking at things, looking at our children. And a lot of them are based on stories, true stories of real experiences. Square Peg, I love that book because this person that wrote this book is now a Harvard professor, but he was failing all throughout school. I mean, he just struggled so much with school. And he talks so much about how important it was that he had those few people in his life, including his mother, who really supported him and saw the good in him. And he absolutely thinks that is 100% what led to his long-term success. And so I think that's really powerful. And then this is the last quote that's kind of my takeaway. This is that same psychologist that wrote the article about shame. She's done research for years on this issue of shame and ADHD. And she says, after 2 years of research and writing, my primary conclusion was this. Here's the takeaway. The stigmas that those with ADHD face for not fitting into the traditional system can be more harmful than the ADHD itself, which I would agree with 100% from what I have seen after working for years with these kids. Being supported and empowered to figure out one's own way is more predictive of success than the elimination of symptoms. So what that means is we really need to kind of shift our focus. And rather than focusing so much on the ADHD symptoms and on the diagnosis and how can we fix it or how can we change it, we need to focus on how do our kids view themselves, how do we build their confidence, how do we empower them and support them, and that's what's going to lead to the long-term success. So I think that's the takeaway message that I hope you all will remember from this. And then just like I said, if you have questions, or want to reach out, I would be happy to answer any questions or send articles or websites that would be helpful. So that's all.
For sure. Thank you, Lindsay. That was really good. We did have a comment in the chat box that somebody was recommending the Mitchells versus the Machines on Netflix. The protagonist, Katie Mitchell, is considered ODD. By her classmates and does not have any friends. She's very creative with obvious traits of ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, and making films on her computer in preparation for college in film school. And so basically it's her story, and it's kind of from beginning to end and a successful outcome. So anyway, it was just worth mentioning to check that out. And again, it was the Mitchells versus the Machines. One thing that you
can I add another one to that real quick?
Yes.
My kids somehow found the show Big City Greens, and I swear there's a kid on that show that absolutely has ADHD, and the way that the show addresses it is so wonderful. Like they really kind of show the positives of it, and they show the challenges as well as the positives. And my kids have been so drawn to that.
That was Big City
Big
Greens.
City Greens it's a cartoon, yes. But
Okay.
I really like that idea also of just looking for shows and books that kind of build up kids who might be different and whose brains work differently. I think that's really helpful to our kids, and it kind of helps to normalize it for them and helps to build that positive self-perception. Mm-hmm.
Also, I think one of the things, you know, my kids are older, and every year is a challenge and a difference. You said, you know, testing every few years, their brains are changing, and the challenges change through the years. The issues change through the years. But one of the things that I would say that I learned, one of the biggest takeaways, is to retrain my own brain, okay?
Yes.
To regroup. And I, as a parent, needed to get out of the boat, because we're all in this boat of comparison of when did they walk and when did they talk, and are they gifted, are they not gifted, and how did they do on their math test? Well, everybody else did good on their math test. Like we're always like in this, it's almost like it's a sick competition.
It is.
With everybody else. And because of that competition, as a parent, if we don't watch it, we're making our kids crazy with this unfair, totally unfair comparison. So when I was able to get out of my own way, and some of that, I was able to see, I was able to better see. So like when you ask a parent, Lindsay, well, what are your kids' strengths? And they're looking at you and like, got nothing.
Yeah.
You know, I was actually able to view more clearly what truly those strengths were and build on those. But when you're in that boat of comparison and where everybody else is and measuring up, because that's where we're always talking about, like they're falling short at school, your parent teacher conferences or whatever else, or if you're in the principal's office, or, you know, their behavior, whatever it is. But when you start, you know, forget that and forget what, you know, and start looking at what they're great at, like you said, the whole paradigm shifts, the whole outlook on everything. And then as a parent, it's a lot easier to be that parent that you wanted to be. That, you know,
yeah.
to be calm, to be loving, to be supportive, and to help move them in that direction. So this is so good. Let me see. I'm going to check the chat box to see.
Okay.
Okay. So we have one. In research, I have read that it is also important to emphasize and understand that ADHD is a diagnosis of exclusion, specifically looking at it from a nervous system aspect, as the impact of cognition, function, and dysregulation could present itself in several other conditions. Can a person that was diagnosed with ADHD as a child be diagnosed with personality disorder?
Well, sure, that can absolutely happen. I think having ADHD and having an ADHD brain does not rule out other possibilities that may develop or may show themselves as you grow, as you get older. And it also doesn't mean that it was necessarily misdiagnosed as a child if you were then later diagnosed with a personality disorder. You can have both of those differences, right? I mean, ADHD, like I said, is just a way that your brain is wired. And so you can have that brain wiring along with other things, other differences or other challenges, which is why we see lots of comorbid types of diagnoses with ADHD.
And I know we're ending, this meeting is over at 7:30, so we're wrapping up right away. But the other side about some of these other diagnoses is like, you know, having all these initials behind, you know, these titles, these diagnoses behind the child isn't always necessarily helpful. But some of these, like personality disorder, or like one of the newer ones they throw around is that disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, DMDD.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these ADHD, ODD, you know, PTSD, there's so many of these different initials, and a lot of them have similarities, but the truth of the matter is their brains aren't even fully formed until they're 26. So while they may have some of these things that appear to be some of these other things, they may or may not be. Don't you agree with that?
Well, sure, that can absolutely happen. As our brains continue to develop, then we can no longer struggle with certain things. So even with that diagnosis of ADHD, we are not able to define that as a disorder or a diagnosis unless it's causing any impairment in functioning. And it may not be impairing your functioning, but you may have a brain that is wired that way, and you would not meet the criteria as having this disorder. But then we also have kids who maybe meet the criteria when they're younger, and then as they get older and their brains continue to develop, then it's no longer impairing their functioning, or they've learned strategies and skills and they are able to do well and function well, and they no longer meet the criteria for having that. Now, that's less common. I would say the research tells us that in the majority of cases, kids that we determine at a younger age do have this type of brain, they will continue to have a lot of those same characteristics as they get older because it's the way that their brain is wired. But it's just a matter of, is it impairing their functioning or not? That's kind of the real question. And that's where all these letters come from. That's how we make these diagnoses. We're really trying to figure out if there's something that is impairing someone's functioning, and do they need extra outside support and help with that in order to function better. That's where the letters come in. So the diagnoses and the letters themselves are not important. It's more about kind of understanding them better and the way their brain works, and whether they need extra help and support.
And to me, I think that's where the testing comes in. So it's not just the diagnosis, it's what do we do about it? So like, yes, once you have, this clear picture that you've had the testing and you know what you know, then what types of therapy, what types of treatment are appropriate, and kind of working through that. And then all I would say is earlier is better. If you're just finding this out, great. Or if you didn't know about treatment, just get started. Because to me, it's a journey. It's not an overnight. There's not a magic pill. There's not a magic fix. It's a journey. And I don't even really think it doesn't end once they turn 21. Okay. No. It keeps going. So, well, Lindsay, thank you again for being amazing and joining us tonight. And thank you for all of this good word, and honestly, just a little bit of encouragement to just be back to where we want to be as parents, and be the encouraging people that we want to be. So thank you for that. And we certainly look forward to having you again.
Thanks, Allison.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you all.